You already know they survived, but not what they had to survive through, because for them, survival wasn't the end of the story, it was the hardest part. This is the true story of people who fell from the sky and lived, but not without cost. You've probably heard about the plane crash in the Andes, the one where the survivors ended up eating the bodies of the dead. It's the kind of story that's been repeated so many times, it's almost become a headline without weight. But what most people don't know, what they never really ask, is how those survivors made it to the point where that decision became the only one left. Because this isn't just a story about cannibalism. It's a story about being forgotten, about impossible cold, about hunger so deep it changes your sense of time, and more than anything else, it's about what people hold on to when everything else is gone. October 13th, 1972. A Fairchild turboprop, operated by the Uruguayan Air Force, takes off from Montevideo. On board are 45 people, players from the Old Christians Rugby Club, along with some of their family, friends, and 5 crew members. The team is headed to Chile for a friendly match. Most of them are in their late teens or early 20s, and the atmosphere on the flight is light. They're laughing, joking, some are nervous about crossing the Andes, but there's no sense that they're in danger. That changes the next day. Bad weather forces them to overnight in Mendoza, Argentina. The following afternoon, they're cleared to continue the flight. The pilots, both experienced, decide to cross the Andes through a mountain pass known as the Planchon route. It's not easy terrain. The weather is cloudy, visibility is low, and navigation is mostly done by sight and dead reckoning. At some point during the flight, the pilots become convinced they've passed the mountains and begin to descend towards Santiago. They hadn't passed the mountains. At 3:34 p.m., the plane hits the side of a glacier-covered ridge. The tail section rips off immediately, taking several passengers with it. The wings shear away, and the fuselage, now just a metal cylinder, slides violently down the mountain slope before coming to rest in a narrow valley surrounded by peaks on all sides. 12 people die instantly. Several more are critically injured, and the rest, 29 in total, are alive, but barely, at nearly 12,000 feet above sea level, surrounded by nothing but rock and snow. No trees, no animals, no signs of life. Take a second and put yourself there. No phone, no radio, no rescue plan, just the people who happened to survive the crash, huddled together inside the broken fuselage, trying to stay warm, using seat covers and scraps of insulation. You're breathing air so thin it hurts your head. You're eating nothing because there's nothing to eat. Just a few chocolate bars and a couple bottles of wine that run out in the first few days. And then you're just waiting. That's what they did. They waited for days. And then they found a small radio. And that's when they heard it. The search had been called off. The outside world had stopped looking. They'd been declared dead. That moment changed everything. The hope of rescue was gone. Now it was just them, the mountains, and the question none of them wanted to ask out loud. How do we stay alive? What came next wasn't a moment of madness. It wasn't chaos. It was a series of calm, deliberate conversations. These were people who knew each other. They'd grown up together. They were students, brothers, teammates. But they were starving. Their bodies were collapsing. They'd burned through their own fat and muscle. There was nothing left. And so, they made a decision. They would eat the bodies of the dead. They did it with prayer, with guilt, with tears. But they did it because they wanted to live. They used shards of aluminum from the wreckage to carefully slice frozen flesh from the bodies, starting with the skin, then the muscle, later the organs. They dried pieces in the sun when they could, and they kept records. They documented what they were doing with a camera, taking photographs of the dead and the camp as it changed over the weeks. They weren't proud of it, but they didn't hide it either. Even then, there were limits. By late October, they'd managed to build a rhythm, if you can call it that. They had routines. They organized the wreckage, kept watch for planes, managed what little they had. It was still hell, but it was a hell they could name, day after day. And then, the mountain moved. On the night of October 29th, an avalanche struck their shelter as they slept. It happened in seconds. The snow poured in through the broken fuselage, filling the space, burying them alive. Those who were closer to the back were crushed instantly. Others were pinned. Some managed to clear small pockets of air and claw toward the surface. The rest, 8 people, didn't make it. Among them was Marcelo Perez, the team captain, the one who had held them together since day one. Also among the dead was Liliana Methol, the last surviving woman. Her husband, Javier, survived the avalanche. He would later say that losing her, in that way, after all they'd already endured, broke something inside him. For those who remained, the avalanche was worse than the crash. The crash had been sudden, brutal, but it was something they'd survived. The avalanche came later, after they had adapted, after they had found a way to keep going. It took away the sense that anything could be controlled. And yet, even in that moment, they drew a line. After Liliana's body was recovered from the snow, the group made a decision. They would not use it for food, not her, not now. Out of respect, out of something deeper. She was wrapped carefully and laid to rest apart from the others, untouched, even as their hunger grew sharper and the cold crept closer. In that decision, silent, collective, and absolute, they reminded themselves that they hadn't lost everything. Not yet. Not everyone was able to follow the group's decision. Meanwhile, the survivors tried to plan. They rationed. They reinforced the fuselage. They marked paths in the snow to try to find the missing tail section. And they waited for the weather to break because they knew that at some point, if they wanted to survive, they would have to go get help themselves. In December, over 50 days after the crash, 3 of them set out: Fernando Parado, Roberto Canessa, and Antonio Vizintin. The plan was simple: climb west over the mountains and find someone. Vizintin turned back after a few days to conserve food. Parado and Canessa kept going. They walked for 10 days, through snow and ice, climbing to altitudes over 14,000 feet, with nothing more than makeshift boots, a little dried flesh, and a sleeping bag sewn together from aircraft insulation. Their only real guide was the sun, and the belief that civilization lay west. Every breath burned in their lungs. The cold was constant. Their legs ached, their feet swelled and bled inside plastic-wrapped shoes. At night, they buried themselves in snow to stay warm. On the 3rd day, they reached what they later learned was Mount Sealer. What stood before them wasn't a gentle slope or a pass. It was a sheer wall of ice and rock, nearly 100 meters high. They called it the Mountain of the Grave, because standing at its base, it looked like the end. But they climbed it anyway. With no gear, no rope, no crampons, just their hands and will, they inched up that frozen face, cutting footholds in the snow, clinging to rock. Every movement risked a fall that would have killed them instantly. It took hours, and when they reached the top, they didn't find the green valleys they had imagined, just more snow, more silence. At one point, their food ran out. They ate the last scrap of dried meat, knowing that if no one appeared, they would die up there. But they didn't stop. And then they saw a shape, a Chilean herdsman across a river. They couldn't shout loud enough to be heard, so they wrote a note, wrapped it around a rock, and threw it across. "I come from a plane that crashed in the mountains," it read. "I am Uruguayan. We need help." That message saved 16 lives. 2 days later, helicopters reached the crash site. The survivors were airlifted out, one by one. After 72 days in the Andes, they were finally safe. When the world learned what they had done to survive, the first reaction was outrage, but that didn't last. The survivors didn't hide. They told their story clearly, without shame. They didn't apologize, because they didn't have to. Public opinion changed. The world realized this wasn't savagery, this was survival. Some of them went on to write books, others returned to quiet lives, but none of them ever forgot the mountains, the silence, the cold, the decisions. And maybe that's the thing worth remembering. It's easy to say, "I would never." It's harder to say that when you're starving in the snow, when your body is failing, when your friends are dying. This wasn't a story about what they did, it was about what it cost. If stories like this speak to you, raw, real, impossible stories, take a second to subscribe. This channel is all about survival, not spectacle. Just people, pushed beyond the edge, and what they did to stay alive. You probably don't know her name, but on the night of June 29th, 2009, just off the coast of the Comoros Islands, Bahia Bakari was the only living person in a sea full of wreckage. 14 years old, no life vest, no flashlight, just a broken piece of airplane and a question no one could answer. How was she still alive? If you think this is a miracle story, it is, but not for the reasons people usually think. Bahia was born and raised in France. That summer, she was flying to the Comoros with her mother to visit family. Yemenia, Flight 626, left Paris, stopped in Marseille, then continued to Sana'a in Yemen. The final leg, the one to Moroni, was flown by a different aircraft, an older Airbus A310. From the moment Bahia and her mother boarded, something felt off. The cabin was loud and disorganized. The air was hot. There were no emergency instructions, no visible life jackets. The plane looked tired, like it had been patched together too many times. Bahia didn't say anything, but she felt uneasy. You've probably had that feeling before, the kind where something just doesn't sit right. But what do? You buckle in. You trust the system. You fly. It was around 1:50 in the morning when the plane began its final approach to Moroni. The weather was rough, strong winds, turbulence, low visibility. The crew had difficulty aligning with the runway. The aircraft was coming in too high, too fast. The pilots tried to correct their descent, but it was too late. The plane stalled and crashed into the sea, just a few kilometers off the coast. There were 153 people on board. 152 died. Only one person survived. Bahia doesn't remember the impact. The last thing she recalls is her mother's hand and a scream. Then nothing. When she opened her eyes, she was in the ocean, floating in darkness, clinging to a piece of debris. She had no life jacket. Her collarbone was broken, her leg was injured. She didn't know where she was or what had happened. She screamed for her mother, again and again. No one answered. She was alone. Now, imagine that, 14 years old. It's pitch black. You're surrounded by ocean, jet fuel, and silence. You don't know if anyone else is alive. You don't know if anyone's coming. And still, you hold on. She floated like that for 9 hours. She drank salt water without realizing it. She vomited. She faded in and out of consciousness. At one point, she heard voices. Soft, distant, maybe other survivors. She called out. But the voices didn't get closer. Eventually, they faded. Later, she would understand they weren't real. They were hallucinations, the brain's way of protecting itself from total collapse. At dawn, she saw the horizon, a blur of sky and water, and then a small boat. It wasn't the Coast Guard. It wasn't international rescue. It was a group of local fishermen in a wooden skiff, out early, looking for signs of the crash. They saw something in the water, a shape, a figure. At first they thought it was debris. Then it moved. They pulled her aboard, thin, burned by the sun, eyes red from jet fuel. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. The first thing she said was, "Where's my mother?" She didn't know. No one did. Bahia was evacuated to a hospital in Moroni, then flown back to France. She had cuts, bruises, a fractured pelvis, and severe emotional trauma. But she was alive. The media called her La Miraculée, the miracle girl. But Bahia didn't feel like a miracle. She felt grief, confusion, loss. She couldn't explain why she had survived when no one else had. In time, investigations revealed what should never have been hidden. The Airbus A310 used by Yemenia on that route had been flagged for years. It had been banned from flying in French airspace. Maintenance records were incomplete. The crew had skipped basic safety checks. The passengers, including Bahia and her mother, were never given a chance. And yet, Bahia never used her survival to point fingers. She gave a few quiet interviews. She wrote a book, Moi Bahia, la Miraculée, not to explain the crash, but to talk about her mother, about what it means to lose someone in a second, and about what it takes to stay afloat when you don't know why you're still here. There are no grand lessons in this story, just a girl, in the dark, clinging to metal, asking for her mother. She didn't survive because she was stronger or braver or chosen. She survived because, for 9 hours, She refused to let go. And maybe that's the quiet power of her story. It wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic, it was just real and unforgettable. You've probably taken a flight without ever thinking much about what's holding you up. Metal wings, cabin pressure, trust. Most of us don't imagine what happens when all of that disappears. Vesna Vulović didn't imagine it either, until the moment she fell, not from a hill or a building or even a mountain, but from the sky, over 33,000 feet, without a parachute, and survived. It was January 26, 1972. Vesna Vulović was a 22-year-old flight attendant for JAT Yugoslav Airlines, blonde, cheerful, ambitious. She loved her job, and on that day she was scheduled to work a flight from Stockholm to Belgrade, with stops in Copenhagen and Zagreb. She wasn't even supposed to be on that flight. A scheduling mix-up had confused her with another employee who had the same name, but Vesna went anyway. The aircraft was a Douglas DC-9. The flight from Stockholm to Copenhagen was uneventful. Then, just after takeoff from Copenhagen, as the plane passed over what's now the Czech Republic, something happened. An explosion in the baggage compartment ripped the plane apart in midair. The fuselage disintegrated. Passengers, seats, metal, everything was scattered across the sky. It was silent, sudden, and irreversible. The official investigation would later point to a suitcase, a device planted during the stop in Stockholm. But Vesna never knew any of that, because she lost consciousness almost immediately. What happened next should have been impossible. Vesna was in the rear of the aircraft, still strapped to her seat. That section, the very back of the fuselage, did not disintegrate. Instead, it broke away and fell, spiraling through the air. She was trapped inside, wedged by a service cart, which may have prevented her from being ejected like the others. The tail section dropped for over 10,000 meters, more than 33,000 feet, before hitting the side of a snow-covered hill near the village of Srpska Kamenice. The slope was steep, the ground was frozen, and the trees were thick, but somehow they absorbed just enough of the impact to keep her alive. She was found by a local man named Bruno Honka, a former army medic who heard her faint cries among the wreckage. When he reached her, she was broken, bleeding, unconscious, or barely aware, but alive. She had a fractured skull, her legs were crushed, her pelvis was shattered, 3 vertebrae were broken, leaving her temporarily paralyzed from the waist down. Her ribs were cracked, her uniform was torn and soaked in blood, her shoes were gone, ripped off during the fall, and she remembered none of it. Vesna spent 27 days in a coma, 6 months in a full-body cast, more than a year in the hospital. At first, doctors didn't think she would survive. Then they told her she would never walk again. But 10 months later, she stood on her own. She joked about it sometimes, said it was because of spinach and cod liver oil. But behind the humor was a long, silent struggle. Months of pain, of relearning how to move, of living with injuries that never fully healed. For a while, she became a national symbol. Marshal Tito awarded her honors. Journalists wrote about her like a miracle. The Guinness Book of Records confirmed it. No one has ever survived a fall from the height without a parachute. But Vesna never liked the attention. She returned to work for the airline, but not as a flight attendant, just a quiet desk job. She never flew again. She said she wasn't afraid of flying. She simply didn't remember the fall. The trauma had wiped everything. All she had were the scars and the questions. Over the years, she lived modestly in Belgrade, surrounded by books, music, and cats. She never married. She kept her life simple. When asked what she thought about surviving, she often answered quietly. "It would have been easier to die," she once said. But she didn't say it with bitterness, just honesty. She had to rebuild everything, not just her body, but her identity, her place in the world. In the 1990s, she became briefly active in politics, opposing the Milosevic regime. But mostly she stayed out of the spotlight. No speeches, no memoirs, just interviews now and then, always circling back to the same disbelief. Why me? Vesna Vulović died in 2016. She was found in her apartment by friends. She was 66 years old. Her story remains one of the most extraordinary survival cases in history. But maybe what makes it powerful isn't just the height she fell from. It's what came after. The months in silence, the years of walking again, the quiet life she built out of broken bones and questions with no answers. She never tried to turn her survival into a message. She never claimed to be chosen. She just lived, and that in itself was enough.